You never forget the sound of your own eulogy, especially when you're still alive to hear it. For me, it wasn't spoken over a casket, but across the sterile expanse of a polished mahogany conference table. The air in the room was cold, recycled, smelling faintly of glass cleaner and corporate indifference. Blair Vance, the new CEO of Innovatic and heir to her father's empire, sat opposite me. She wore a power suit that probably cost more than my first car, tailored to look severe and effortless all at once. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of sympathetic resolve. It was the kind of look people practice in a mirror. She said, "Calvin, your contributions to this company and to my father's legacy have been invaluable." I remember thinking that was the exact word I would have used, invaluable. I wrote it for her father, Arthur, in his farewell address just 2 months prior. The irony was a bitter pill. She continued, her voice smooth and level, a perfect imitation of the boardroom confidence she'd seen her father perform, but it was just that, a performance. But as Innovatic moves into a new chapter, it's vital that I find my own voice. Her eyes, a pale, chilly blue, met mine without a flicker of genuine emotion. And to do that, I need a clean slate. A clean slate. 10 years of my life, my creativity, my soul wiped clean with a trite corporate platitude. A decade of being the ghost in the machine, the silent partner to a brilliant but severely dyslexic CEO. Arthur Vance was a titan, a genius of engineering and product design, but when it came to the written or spoken word, he was lost in a fog. The letters would swim, the sentences would fracture. He'd see a page of text, not as information, but as an assault. That's where I came in. I was Calvin Hayes, his speechwriter, his memo drafter, his visionary quarterly report crafter. I was officially on the payroll as a senior communications strategist, a title deliberately vague enough to cover the truth. In reality, I was the voice of Arthur Vance. Every grand vision, every soaring keynote, every folksy yet firm internal memo that defined his leadership and built Innovatic into a billion-dollar giant, it all came from my keyboard. We were a two-man system, a perfect symbiosis of his technical brilliance and my narrative craft. He gave me the concepts, the raw, jagged pieces of genius, and I polished them into the coherent, inspiring language that moved markets and motivated employees. He was the architect. I was the one who drew the blueprints everyone else could read. Now his daughter, who inherited the throne but not the mind, was telling me she needed to find her own voice. The sheer breathtaking ignorance of that statement almost made me laugh. She had no idea that the voice she associated with her father, the voice she revered and was now studying from a folder of his old speeches, was sitting right in front of her, being politely and systematically erased. The man who wrote those words now worked for her biggest competitor, but she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that I was a relic of her father's era, a piece of old furniture to be cleared out. The HR director, a nervous man named Peterson, who I'd personally written the congratulatory email for when he got the job, slid a thick folder across the table. My severance package. A non-disclosure agreement as thick as a novel, the usual termination liturgy. He avoided my eyes, focusing on a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. It was a framed copy of Innovatic's mission statement. I'd written that too. I looked back at Blair. "I understand," I said, my voice betraying nothing. It was a line I'd taught Arthur to use. It projected calm control, even in retreat. It seemed to unnerve her more than any protest would have. She expected a fight, or pleading. She didn't know that men like me don't fight battles we've already mapped out. We just choose the next battlefield. As I stood up to leave, my entire decade at Innovatic already being packed into a cardboard box by a security guard, Blair offered one last, hollow pleasantry. "Thank you for everything, Calvin. We wish you the best." I just nodded, a lifetime of words locked behind my teeth. She had her father's name and his corner office, but his voice had just walked out the door, and I had a feeling she was going to miss it. Her first all-hands meeting was next week. She was about to step onto a stage in front of 3,000 employees and deliver her grand 5-year plan. She was probably, at that very moment, staring at that folder of her father's speeches, trying to absorb his magic, not realizing the magician had just vanished. And the real show was about to begin. If you've ever poured your heart and soul into a job only to be shown the door, you know the feeling. Let me know what you think of my story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about when the system gets a hard reset. The drive home was a study in silence. The city blurred past my windows, a watercolor of brake lights and neon signs, but I saw none of it. My world had shrunk to the space inside my car, the hum of the engine, the feel of the leather-wrapped steering wheel under my cold, steady hands. There was no anger, not yet. That would come later. For now, there was just a profound, hollow emptiness. It felt like a part of me had been amputated without anesthesia. I wasn't just an employee who had lost his job. I was a creator who had lost his creation. Innovatech wasn't just a company to me. I had helped build its very soul word by word. I had crafted its identity, given it a voice that was trusted by its employees and revered by the industry. And now, that voice had been silenced, and I had been rendered a ghost. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. I sat there for a long time, the cardboard box of my professional life sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Inside were a few personal effects, a framed picture of my wife, a coffee mug with a faded Relic logo, and a worn-out mouse pad. 10 years reduced to a box of trinkets. It was humiliating. I finally got out, carried the box inside, and set it on the floor of my home office. The room was my sanctuary, lined with bookshelves filled with history, philosophy, and poetry. It was where the real work had always been done. My wife Sarah found me there an hour later. She didn't say anything at first, just came and stood behind my chair, her hands resting gently on my shoulders. The tension I hadn't even realized I was holding began to dissolve under her touch. She saw the box. She knew. She simply asked, "What happened?" I told her. I recounted the conversation with Blair, the cold finality of it, the part about her needing to find her own voice. Sarah's grip tightened. "The fool," she murmured. "The absolute, arrogant fool." She knew the truth. She was the only other person on the planet who knew the full extent of my arrangement with Arthur. She had been there for the late nights, the frantic pre-dawn rewrites, the crushing stress before a major keynote. She understood that my job was less about writing and more about a form of high-stakes intellectual alchemy. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner we barely touched, I retreated back to my office. I didn't turn on the computer. Instead, I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, a ritual I'd developed over the years to quiet my mind. The fragrant steam filled the air, a familiar comfort in a world suddenly made unfamiliar. As I sat there, cradling the warm cup, the memories began to flood in. This wasn't just a job loss. It was a betrayal of a sacred trust, and the weight of it was immense. I remembered my first meeting with Arthur Vance. I was a young, hungry freelance writer with a decent portfolio. He was already a legend in the tech world, the founder of Relic, a company built on his groundbreaking patents. He'd summoned me to his office, a sprawling space on the top floor with panoramic views of the city. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pushed a draft of a press release across his desk. It was a mess. A jumble of technical jargon, fragmented sentences, and run-on thoughts. It was brilliant and completely incomprehensible at the same time. He watched me as I read it, his eyes sharp and intelligent, but there was a flicker of something else there, something I couldn't place. Vulnerability. I looked up. "Mr. Vance," I said, "the ideas in here are revolutionary, but the language, it's a barrier." He leaned back in his chair, a big man who suddenly seemed smaller. He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from a deep, weary place. "Son," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I can design a microprocessor that can change the world. I can see the architecture of a global network in my head. But when I look at a page of words, they dance. They mock me." It was a confession of a magnitude I couldn't have fathomed. Arthur Vance, the visionary, was severely dyslexic. He explained that for years he'd managed by keeping his communications brief, technical, and delegating anything more complex. But the company was growing. It needed a voice. It needed a story. He needed a translator. He looked me straight in the eye. I don't need a speechwriter, Calvin. I need a partner. I need someone who can take the noise in my head and turn it into music. Can you do that? That was the beginning of our decade-long collaboration. It was an intense, symbiotic relationship built on absolute trust. Our process became a finely tuned machine. He would call me at all hours, pacing his office, spilling out a torrent of brilliant, disjointed ideas about the future of technology, about the human element in a digital world. I would sit, listen, and type, not just transcribing but interpreting. I learned to understand the rhythm of his thoughts, to see the patterns in his intellectual chaos. I would take his raw data, the engineering specs, the market analysis, the philosophical musings, and weave them into the powerful, elegant narratives that became his trademark. I wrote the speeches that brought investors to their feet. I wrote the internal memos that calmed a nervous workforce during a market downturn. I wrote the quarterly reports that were less about numbers and more about a compelling vision of the future, a story that analysts and journalists repeated verbatim. We once spent an entire weekend locked in his office, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of mission, crafting a response to a hostile takeover bid. It wasn't a financial defense. It was a narrative one. I wrote a letter to the shareholders, not as a CEO but as a founder, reminding them of the soul of the company we had built together. It worked. The bid collapsed. Arthur slapped me on the back, his eyes shining with relief and gratitude. We did it, Calvin. We did it. In those moments, we were more than just a CEO and his writer. We were a single entity. I remember the terror and triumph of the Global Tech Summit in Berlin. It was Arthur's biggest keynote. 3,000 people in the audience, a live global broadcast. The night before, he was struggling. The new material wasn't settling in his mind. He couldn't get the flow. We stayed up until 4 a.m., me reading the lines to him over and over, turning them into a rhythm, a song he could remember. We had it. It was perfect. The next day he walked on stage, confident and commanding. He started strong, and then, 5 minutes in, the teleprompter went blank. A collective gasp went through our support staff in the wings. I saw a flicker of panic in Arthur's eyes. He faltered for a second, without thinking. I grabbed a spare earpiece from the audio tech, connected it to my phone where I had the speech open, and spoke into the phone's microphone. "The future isn't about code," I whispered. "It's about connection." Arthur's eyes found mine in the wings. He took a breath and repeated the line. For the next 40 minutes, I delivered the entire speech to him, line by line, a whisper in his ear that became a roar in the auditorium. He never missed a beat. He was magnificent. When it was over, the applause was thunderous. No one ever knew. Backstage, he gripped my shoulder, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't say thank you. He just said, "I couldn't see the words, Calvin, but I could hear the music." That was the man Blair Vance thought she knew. That was the legacy she thought she was inheriting. A legacy built on a secret she was never meant to understand. The memory faded, and the cold reality of my present situation rushed back in. The betrayal wasn't just that I was fired. It was that my entire contribution, the very essence of my professional life, had been deemed so insignificant that it could be dismissed without a second thought. It was the ultimate act of being professionally undervalued. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. The thought surfaced in my mind, sharp and clear. And for the first time since leaving that conference room, I felt a flicker of something other than emptiness. It was a cold, hard ember of resolve. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me out of my reverie. I glanced at the screen, an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Calvin Hayes," I said, my voice hoarse. "Calvin, Mark Ellison here." The name hit me like a jolt of electricity. Mark Ellison was the CEO of Nexus Dynamics, Innovate's fiercest and most respected competitor. He and Arthur had been rivals for 20 years, a relationship built on a foundation of sharp competition and grudging professional respect. What could he possibly want with me? I heard about what happened at Innovate, he said, his voice direct and devoid of pity, a shame. Arthur built a great company, but a company is more than its founder. You know that better than anyone. I was stunned into silence. How did he know? He must have seen the shock on my face, even through the phone line. Calvin, he continued. The tech industry is a small town. People talk. And anyone who ever really listened to Arthur speak for more than 5 minutes knew they weren't just hearing an engineer. They were hearing a storyteller. I've been trying to figure out who his storyteller was for years. Now I know. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. I'm not calling to offer condolences. I'm calling to offer an opportunity. I'm building something new here at Nexus, a new direction. I have the technology. I have the engineers. What I don't have is a narrative. I don't have a voice. He named a title, Chief Strategy and Communications Officer, not a ghostwriter, a chief. He named a salary that made my eyes water. He offered a signing bonus that was more than my entire severance package. But it wasn't the money that made my heart start to beat faster. It was the final thing he said. I don't want you to be my voice. Calvin, I want you to teach my whole company how to speak. Your name, your strategy, front and center. What do you say? The fog of despair that had enveloped me for hours began to lift, burned away by the heat of a new dawning purpose. Blair Vance wanted a clean slate. Fine, I would give her one. She would have her company, her title, her father's old speeches, and I would take the one thing that truly mattered. I would take the voice, and I would use it to build an empire for her biggest rival. My quiet resolve hardened into a plan, a cold, methodical, and utterly devastating plan. Blair thought she was preparing for an all-hands meeting. She had no idea she was actually preparing for a war, and she had just fired her only real weapon. A quiet coup doesn't begin with a bang. It begins with a thought, a realization. And my realization, sitting there in my office with Mark Ellison's offer echoing in my ears, was this: Blair hadn't just fired a writer. She had willingly given away her company's most valuable intangible asset. She had given away its identity, and she didn't even know it was missing yet. My secret plan wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I wasn't going to hack their servers or poach their clients with malice. That was too crude, too simple. My plan was more elegant. It was about narrative warfare. I was going to deconstruct the story of Innovate, the very story I had built, and then rebuild it, brick by brick, under the banner of Nexus Dynamics. I was going to steal their soul, and they would watch, helpless, as the world fell in love with their reflection in a competitor's mirror. The first step was to secure my arsenal. Blair had a folder of her father's finished speeches. I had something infinitely more powerful. For 10 years I had obsessively documented my process. My leverage wasn't just the final product, it was the proof of creation. In a series of encrypted hard drives stored in a fireproof safe in my office, I had everything. Audio recordings of my brainstorming sessions with Arthur, hours upon hours of his brilliant, chaotic ramblings and my clarifying questions. Scanned copies of my handwritten notes, where I diagrammed the structure of his arguments. Dozens of drafts for every major speech, showing the evolution from a raw concept to a polished masterpiece. It was a complete, unassailable record of my authorship. It was the DNA of Innovate's corporate voice. Before I even called Mark Ellison back, I called my lawyer. I explained the situation, the decade of work, the sudden termination, the nature of my intellectual contribution. We talked about intellectual property. It was a gray area, deliberately so. My contract stated that all work produced for Innovate was their property. That was standard. But my lawyer pointed out the style, the process, the unique narrative framework I had developed that was a different beast. Was a distinct literary style, a trade secret, or was it the portable skill of a craftsman We could argue it was the latter. It was a debatable point, the kind of legal ambiguity that could keep a team of corporate lawyers tied up in court for years. It was plausible inaccuracy at its finest, a strategic tripwire. My lawyer's advice was simple: don't use any of the old material directly. Instead, use the method. Replicate the style. Let them be the ones to make the claim that a particular way of structuring a sentence is their exclusive property. Let them try to prove in open court that their legendary CEO's voice was in fact a product they had hired out. The idea was beautiful in its simplicity. They could never sue me without revealing the very secret they were trying to protect. My foresight in documenting everything wasn't born of suspicion, but of professional habit. I was a craftsman, and I kept my tools. Now those tools were my weapons. My second call was to Mark Ellison. I accepted his offer. My conditions were simple: full autonomy over the company's strategic messaging, a seat on the executive leadership team, and the resources to build a small elite communications department from the ground up. He agreed without hesitation. My first day was the following Monday. The silent takeover had begun. The next piece of my plan involved activating my network, not for sabotage, but for intelligence. I sent a simple text message to Maria Sanchez. Maria was the director of product marketing at Innovake, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I had mentored for years. She was one of the few people who, while not knowing the full truth about Arthur's dyslexia, had a deep and intuitive understanding of my role. She'd once said to me, "It's incredible, Calvin. Arthur has the vision, but you write the music." She knew. She was loyal to the vision, not the C-suite. My text read, "Coffee, my treat. I have some news." We met the next day at a small cafe miles away from the Innovate campus. I told her I'd been let go. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen the writing on the wall the moment Blair took over. The atmosphere at the office, she said, had become toxic. Blair was running the company like it was a case study from a business school textbook. She was all buzzwords and no substance. Synergy, disruption, paradigm shift. The words were hollow because she didn't understand the concepts behind them. She was trying to be her father, but she was just a pale imitation. "Maria," I said, "I need you to be my eyes and ears." I told her about the offer from Nexus Dynamics. Her eyes widened. She understood the implications immediately. "This isn't just a new job," she said. "This is a checkmate." I asked her to keep me updated on the preparations for the all-hands meeting. I wanted to know everything: the mood, the talking points, the level of panic. She agreed instantly. "It's not about loyalty to you over the company, Calvin," she explained, her expression serious. "It's about loyalty to competence. What Blair is doing, she's stripping the company for parts, starting with its brain. I can't just stand by and watch that." This became my subplot, my B-plot, my live feed from behind enemy lines. Maria was my mole, my loyal ally, providing a running commentary on the unfolding chaos. Her updates were more damning than I could have imagined. Blair was in over her head. She was holding marathon meetings with the senior leadership, demanding visionary thinking. But when they asked for specifics, she would just quote one of her father's old speeches. She was treating his words like scripture, not realizing they were simply the polished output of a complex collaborative process. She was trying to reverse engineer the magic, and all she was getting was a tangled mess of empty phrases. The old guard, the VPs who had worked with Arthur for 20 years, were getting nervous. They could feel the emptiness. The soul was gone. They remembered Arthur's fire, his ability to connect a complex engineering problem to a profound human need. Blair could only repeat the connection. She couldn't forge it herself. My final piece of preparation was a series of deep dive sessions with Mark Ellison and his team at Nexus. We booked a war room, a conference room with floor-to-ceiling whiteboards. I didn't present a marketing plan. I presented a narrative strategy. I put Innovate's brand identity, the one I had painstakingly built, up on the board. I deconstructed it for them. I showed them the core pillars: technical optimism, human-centric design, and a promise of a future that was both aspirational and accessible. This, I told them, is the story that Innovate has been telling the world for 10 years. It's a powerful story. It's the reason they dominate the market, and we are going to take it from them. I explained that we wouldn't compete on processor speeds or memory capacity. That was the old game. We would compete on vision. We would adopt a new voice for Nexus, a voice that sounded remarkably like the one the market already trusted, only clearer, bolder, and more forward-looking. Mark, a brilliant strategist in his own right, saw it instantly. He grinned, a predator's smile. "So we're not just launching a new product line," he said. "We're launching a new gospel, and we're positioning Blair as a false prophet." "Precisely," I replied. We spent the next 2 days mapping it out. The language, the tone, the key messages. It was exhilarating. For the first time, I wasn't a ghost. I was an architect, and my name was on the blueprints. The plan was set. The pieces were in position. Blair was busy memorizing my old lines, preparing for her coronation. She had no idea that I was busy building a new kingdom, right next door, using her own father's tools. The all-hands meeting was in 3 days. The silent takeover was about to go very, very loud. The day before Blair's all-hands meeting was a Tuesday. It started like any other day at Innovate Keck. The usual hum of activity, the smell of slightly burnt coffee from the break rooms, the low murmur of 1,000 people going about their business. But at 9 a.m. sharp, an earthquake hit. It didn't rattle the building, but it shook the company to its very foundation. It arrived silently, in the form of an email, a press release from Nexus Dynamics that landed in the inbox of every major tech journalist, every market analyst, and every single employee at Innovate Keck. I had written it myself the night before, and it was a masterpiece of subtle aggression. The headline was the first shot across the bow: Nexus Dynamics welcomes Calvin Hayes as Chief Strategy and Communications Officer to architect the narrative of tomorrow. The word choice was deliberate: architect, narrative. These were words I had used to define Arthur Vance's role for a decade. To the outside world, it might have seemed like a standard corporate announcement, but to anyone inside the industry, to anyone who had followed Arthur's career, it was a declaration. The body of the press release was even more potent. It was written in the style, my style, the one I had perfected for Arthur. It had the same cadence, the same blend of bold technical optimism with a deeply human-centric focus. It spoke of building bridges between human potential and digital possibility, and crafting a future that doesn't just innovate but inspires. It was laced with phrases that were my signatures, echoes of the voice that had defined Innovate for 10 years. The final paragraph contained a quote from me, my first public statement under my own name. "The future of technology," the quote read, "is not a question of what we can build, but what we should build. It's a conversation, a story we must write together." I am thrilled to be joining Mark Ellison and the brilliant team at Nexus Dynamics to help write the next chapter. It was my voice, unfiltered, and it was now the official voice of Innovate's biggest rival. My phone lit up almost immediately. It was Maria. She was speaking in a hushed, urgent whisper. "Calvin, you absolute madman. It's chaos here. The press release has detonated." She described the scene. VPs were literally running down the hallways. The old guard, the ones who had been with Arthur from the early days, they understood exactly what this meant. They recognized the voice in the press release. They recognized the intellectual fingerprints all over it. It was Arthur's voice, and it was now speaking for the enemy. Blair, Maria told me, was in a state of confused fury. She had stormed out of her office, a printout of the release crumpled in her fist, demanding to know who Calvin Hayes was. She didn't connect the name on the press release to the man she had fired just a week ago. To her, I was just a background figure, a speechwriter. The idea that this architect of tomorrow's narrative could be the same person was so far beyond her comprehension that she didn't even make the link. One of the senior VPs, a man named George, had to gently explain it to her. George said, "Blair, Calvin Hayes is the man you let go last week. He wrote all of your father's speeches. Maria said, the color drained from Blair's face. The arrogance and confidence she had projected all week shattered in an instant, replaced by a dawning horror. She finally understood. She hadn't just fired an employee. She had armed her competitor with a weapon of mass disruption. The panic escalated throughout the day. Maria sent me a stream of updates. The board of directors was calling emergency meetings. Major investors were ringing up, asking for clarification. They all had the same question: how could they let the man who crafted the Vance legacy walk over to Nexus? Blair tried to do damage control. She sent out a company-wide email, dismissing the announcement as a minor staffing change and reaffirming her commitment to her new vision. But the email was a disaster. It was written in bland, sterile corporate speak, full of empty jargon. It was a pathetic, tinny squeak compared to the booming, resonant voice of the Nexus press release. Everyone saw the contrast. The king was dead, and his voice was now speaking from another castle. The next day was the all-hands meeting. It was supposed to be Blair's coronation, her moment to step out of her father's shadow and establish herself as the new leader. Instead, it became her public execution. Maria gave me a live commentary via text message from the auditorium. The atmosphere was tense. The employees, still reeling from the news about me, were not in a celebratory mood. They were anxious and confused. Blair walked onto the stage. She looked polished and professional, but Maria noted a slight tremor in her hands. She launched into her speech, the one she had been studying for weeks, and it was a catastrophe. She was reading my words I had written for Arthur years ago, but she didn't understand them. She delivered the lines with a flat, rehearsed cadence, devoid of the passion and conviction Arthur had possessed. She spoke of vision and legacy, but the words sounded hollow, stolen. She was a bad cover band, playing a classic song, hitting all the notes but missing all the soul. The employees listened in a state of baffled silence. They were hearing familiar phrases, but the music was gone. The grand 5-year plan she unveiled was nothing more than a clumsy remix of her father's old strategies, presented without the compelling narrative that had always made them feel revolutionary. She was presenting the blueprints, but she couldn't describe the cathedral. The real disaster, Maria texted, was the Q&A session. The first question came from a young engineer in the front row. "Miss Vance," he asked, "you talk about building on your father's legacy, but Calvin Hayes, the man who we now know was the voice of that legacy, is now at Nexus. How can we trust the vision you're presenting when the visionary is gone?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. The entire auditorium was silent, waiting. Blair froze. She was completely unprepared for a direct challenge. She stammered, trying to formulate an answer. She fell back on her corporate training. "We appreciate Calvin's past contributions," she said, her voice tight, "but Innovake is more than one person. We are moving forward with a new collaborative strategy." It was the worst possible answer. It was a weak, defensive non-answer, and everyone knew it. The dam broke. More hands went up. The questions became sharper, more pointed. They weren't just about me anymore. They were about her, her plan, her leadership. She had no real answers. She couldn't elaborate on the vision because it had never been hers to begin with. She was a puppet whose strings had been cut, collapsing on a public stage. Maria's final text was chilling. "It's over, Calvin. She's lost them." The whole room, the silent takeover was complete. I hadn't needed to sabotage a single server or steal a single file. I just had to take what was mine, my voice, and let the world hear it from somewhere else. The silence that followed was the sound of an empire beginning to crumble. The fallout from the all-hands meeting was not a slow burn, it was a wildfire. The foundation of trust that Arthur and I had spent a decade building at Innovake was incinerated in a single afternoon. Blair's authority was gone. She was no longer seen as the heir to the throne, but as the usurper who had exiled the king's most trusted advisor. The first wave of the exodus began within 48 hours. It wasn't a coordinated campaign of poaching on my part. I didn't have to make a single call. They came to me. The first was David Chen, Innovake's lead product designer. David was a genius, a man who could turn the most abstract concept into an elegant and intuitive user interface. He and I had worked closely on every major product launch. I would provide the narrative, the why, and he would build the how. He called me on my personal cell. "Calvin," he said, his voice grim. I was in that auditorium. It was a funeral. "She has no idea what we do here. She thinks this place runs on spreadsheets. I can't work like that. I need a story to design for. Are you building a team at Nexus?" I told him I was. He gave his notice the next day. Next came Sarah Jenkins, the top sales director for North America. Sarah was a force of nature, a woman who could sell ice in a blizzard. Her entire sales strategy was built on the narratives I had crafted. She didn't sell products, she sold the Innovate vision. She showed up at the temporary office Nexus had given me. Unannounced, "The playbook is gone, Calvin," she stated, sitting down without being invited. "My team doesn't know what to sell anymore." Blair gave them a list of features. "I need a mission. Your press release, that was a mission. If you're going to war, you're going to need artillery. I'm your artillery." The talent exodus was becoming a flood. It wasn't just senior people, it was key engineers, marketing managers, data scientists, the best and the brightest, the people who understood that a company's success is built on more than just its balance sheet, were abandoning a sinking ship. They weren't just leaving a job, they were following a voice they trusted. I found myself thinking of that phrase again, the one that had become my mantra. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. Innovate was learning that lesson in the most brutal way possible. Blair, predictably, panicked. Her first move was to lash out. A thick envelope arrived at my house via courier. It was from Innovate's legal department, a cease and desist letter dripping with impotent fury. It accused me of violating my non-compete clause, of intellectual property theft, of actively poaching their employees. It was a transparently desperate move. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who drafted a response that was a masterclass in polite legal annihilation. He pointed out that my non-compete was vaguely worded and likely unenforceable, that my style was not a patentable trade secret, and that every employee who had resigned had done so of their own volition, which he had the signed affidavits to prove. He ended the letter with a subtle but devastating threat. Should Innovate choose to pursue this frivolous matter in court, we would welcome the opportunity during discovery to depose Mr. Vance's former executive team regarding Mr. Hayes's specific contributions to the company's voices over the past decade. It was a checkmate. They would have to expose the secret of Arthur's dyslexia and my ghostwriting to the world to even have a chance of winning. They would have to publicly admit that their entire corporate identity was a sham. The legal threat stopped. Her second tactic was even more desperate. My phone rang one evening. It was Blair. Her voice was strained, the arrogant boardroom tone replaced by a thin, brittle edge. "Calvin," she said, skipping any preamble. "This has gone far enough." I waited, silent. Silence was my new weapon. "You've made your point," she continued, a false magnanimity creeping in. "I may have been hasty in my decision. I am prepared to offer you your old position back, with a significant raise. We'll create a new title for you, Vice President of Corporate Narrative. How does that sound?" The offer was laughable. She was offering me a fancier cage in a building that was already on fire. "Blair," I said, my voice calm and even, "why would I do that?" The question seemed to flummox her. "What do you mean?" she stammered. "This is your home. This is your father's legacy." "No, Blair," I replied, the words coming easily now. "My home is where my work is valued. And Arthur's legacy wasn't the company. It was the standard of excellence we built. You've abandoned that standard." A long, tense silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, a ragged sound of frustration and defeat. Then the pleading began. "Please, Calvin," she whispered, the last of her pride crumbling. "I need you. The company, we're in trouble." I listened to her for a moment, to the sound of her world collapsing, a world she had inherited but never earned. The power had shifted completely. She was no longer the CEO dictating terms. She was a desperate woman begging the ghost she had exorcised to please come back and haunt her house again. The answer was no. The final confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown in a boardroom. It was that phone call. It was the moment she finally admitted she was powerless without me. That was the real victory. But the story needed a final, definitive chapter. She made one last, desperate attempt to appeal to my loyalty, my history. "How could you do this to my father's memory?" she asked, her voice thick with accusation. "Everything he built, you're helping our biggest rival tear it all down." The sheer unmitigated gall of that statement broke through my composure. For the first time, I let the cold, hard truth out. "Blair," I said, and my voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a decade of secrets. "Stop talking about your father's legacy. You don't have the first clue what it is. You look at his speeches and you see a visionary. I look at them, and I see the countless nights we spent in his office, him pacing and struggling to find the words, and me drawing them out of him, shaping them, giving them life. Your father was a brilliant man, Blair, a titan of an engineer, a true genius, but every single word you've ever admired from him, every visionary phrase you're desperately trying to copy, every line that built the soul of that company, that was me." A profound silence met my words. It was a silence so deep I could hear the static on the line. I could picture her in her vast, lonely office, the city lights twinkling behind her, the full, crushing weight of the truth finally landing. She hadn't just misjudged a situation. She had fundamentally misunderstood her own reality. She had built her entire identity on a myth. "You wanted to find your own voice," I continued, my tone softening slightly, not out of pity, but for the sake of clarity. "I respect that. But you made a catastrophic mistake. You assumed the voice you heard from your father was his alone. It wasn't. It was ours. And when you wanted a clean slate, you didn't just fire a writer. You fired the voice you thought was your father's. You erased the very thing you were trying to find." I let that sink in. There was nothing more to say. She didn't respond. I heard a small, sharp intake of breath, a sound of utter devastation, then a soft click as she hung up the phone. It was over. The checkmate was complete. The aftermath was swift and brutal. A few weeks later, Nexus Dynamics, with me as the new Chief Strategy and Communications Officer, launched a new initiative. It wasn't a product, it was a platform, a new philosophy for the tech industry. The launch was accompanied by a keynote speech from Mark Ellison, a speech I had written. It was hailed by the industry press as a stunning return to visionary leadership and the most important tech manifesto in a decade. It was of course written in the same style, with the same soul as Arthur Vance's greatest speeches. We didn't just steal Innovake's market share, we stole their identity. Innovake's quarterly earnings report came out a month after that. For the first time in 12 years, they missed their targets. The stock price plummeted by 30% in a single day. The narrative in the financial world had shifted. Innovake's was no longer the stable, visionary leader. It was a rudderless ship, adrift in a sea of its own incompetence. The board, which had once rubber-stamped Blair's every decision, finally acted. She was quietly and unceremoniously removed as CEO. The official press release, a bland and lifeless document, cited personal reasons. The most poignant vindication, however, came from an unexpected source. One evening my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I had a feeling. I answered. "Calvin." The voice was older, raspier than I remembered, but unmistakable. It was Arthur Vance. He was calling from his retirement home in Arizona. "I heard what happened, son," he said, his voice full of a weary sadness. "I am sorry for what Blair did. She never understood." "I know, Arthur," I said softly. There was a long pause. I could hear him take a deep, shaky breath. "You know," he said, "Mark Ellison sent me a recording of his speech. The one you wrote for him." "He did." I was surprised. "Yes," Arthur said, and I could hear a faint smile in his voice. It was damn good. It sounded familiar. He chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. The voice was always yours, Calvin. I just provided the raw materials. You were the architect. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. That, more than the new job, more than the salary, more than Blair's downfall, was my true vindication. It was the acknowledgement from the only other person who truly knew. The circle was closed. My work was finally and fully my own. So here I am. I'm in my new office at Nexus Dynamics. It's twice the size of my old one, with a view that stretches all the way to the bay. The walls are covered in whiteboards, filled with diagrams and notes for our next 5-year plan. David Chen and Sarah Jenkins are here, along with a dozen other brilliant minds who left Innovate to follow a story they believed in. Maria Sanchez is my new director of communications. We are building something new, from the ground up, and it is thrilling. We are not just building products, we are building a narrative, a purpose. And this time my name is on the door. When a company fires a person, they think they're just terminating a contract. They're removing a name from a payroll, clearing out a desk, cutting a line item from a budget, but sometimes they're doing so much more. Sometimes they're cutting out the heart of the operation. They're firing the institutional memory, the secret keeper, the quiet architect who made everything work. They think they're just losing an employee. They don't realize they're losing their soul. They learn always too late. That competence has a voice, and when you silence it, the silence that follows is the sound of collapse. It's a hard lesson, but one that every arrogant manager, every entitled heir, eventually has to learn. Value isn't just about what's on your resume, it's about the unique, irreplaceable way you do what you do. It's your signature, it's your voice. Don't ever let anyone take that from you. And if they try, make sure they understand what it will cost them. That's my story. It's a reminder for anyone who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or erased in their professional life. Your value is real, and your competence is your power. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your own experiences with being undervalued at work. Be sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and of course hit that subscribe button for more stories of vindication and karmic justice. Thanks for listening.